They erased her from his life like she never existed. They called her an inconvenience, a mismatch. When billionaire Brandon Armstrong quietly ended his marriage to Jeanette, the headlines barely whispered her name. He had a radiant new fiancée on his arm, blonde, dazzling, the perfect accessory to his empire, and the world moved on without a second glance. Jeanette simply vanished. But years later, at the most exclusive gala of the season, the grand ballroom doors swung open and every conversation died mid-sentence. Jeanette wasn't just back, she was breathtaking, regal in shimmering white, poised and untouchable, and she wasn't alone. By her side, holding her hand, stood a young boy whose features echoed Brandon's own in a way no one in the room could ignore. This is the story of the forgotten black wife's quiet, devastating return. You won't believe what happens when the truth finally steps into the light. The storm over Manhattan that evening felt personal. Rain lashed against the tinted windows of the Armstrong penthouse on Billionaire's Row, as though the city itself wanted to wash away what was happening inside. For Jeanette Armstrong, standing in the vast marble foyer with a single suitcase at her feet, the thunder was the only sound that felt honest. Everything else, the hushed voice of the lawyer, the distant clink of crystal as staff cleared away the dinner she had spent all day preparing, was muffled, unreal. Moments earlier, her marriage had ended with clinical precision. Brandon Armstrong, the man she had believed in when his company was only ambition and late-night phone calls. The man whose dreams she had quietly supported while building a life beside him, had delivered his verdict without raising his voice. "It's about perception, Jeanette," he'd said, straightening the knot of his tie in the reflection of a gilded mirror. He didn't look at her. He never really needed to anymore. Armstrong Global is expanding into new circles. The board, the partners, the investors, they expect a certain alignment. You're elegant, you're intelligent, but you're not. He gestured vaguely, as if the words were too tiresome to finish. "Not what, Brandon?" Jeanette had asked, her voice steady even as something inside her fractured. She was wearing the simple silk blouse she'd chosen for what she thought would be a quiet anniversary dinner. Her hair was pulled back neatly, nothing flashy, nothing that demanded attention. "You're not the image we need moving forward," he said finally, meeting her eyes at last. Cold, resolved. "Cassandra fits. She understands the room. She amplifies the brand." Cassandra. The name settled between them like frost. Cassandra Hale, tall, golden-haired, with a smile that photographed perfectly, and a lineage that opened doors Brandon now wanted wide open. The kind of woman who turned heads and sealed deals in the same breath. Jeanette had nodded once. She had signed where the lawyer pointed. She had accepted the generous settlement meant to purchase her silence and her absence. And then she had walked out into the storm, carrying a secret Brandon would never think to question. Jeanette Armstrong had never been loud about her love. She gave it in the quiet ways that built empires without demanding credit. In the early days, when Brandon was still burning midnight oil in a cramped midtown office, it was Jeanette who proofread his pitch decks at 2 a.m., who reheated takeout Thai when he forgot to eat, who smiled patiently through investor dinners where she was introduced only as "my wife." She had left a promising career in corporate law to manage the invisible scaffolding of his ambition, scheduling, soothing, strategizing, so he could stand in the spotlight unburdened. Her skin was a rich, deep brown that glowed under any light. Her voice carried the calm cadence of old money Atlanta. Her beauty was undeniable, yet somehow, in those rooms full of venture capitalists and legacy heirs, it was treated as incidental, decorative, not strategic. Brandon never said it outright in the beginning. The disrespect arrived in increments so small they felt like nothing at all. A partner at a Hamptons weekend once asked in front of her whether Brandon planned to upgrade the branding once the Series C closed. Everyone laughed, including Brandon. Jeanette laughed too, a beat late, and changed the subject to the vintage of the rose. At gala tables, seating charts mysteriously placed her beside junior associates while Brandon was flanked by daughters of board members whose fathers controlled billions. Photographers angled their lenses past her shoulder to capture Brandon with whichever heiress happened to be nearby. The society pages ran captions that read, "Brandon Armstrong and guests," as if she was simply part of the furniture. She told herself it was temporary, that once the company stabilized, once the IPO dreams settled into reality, he would see her again, the woman who had believed in him when his net worth was measured in ramen packets and stubborn hope. She wore the dresses he preferred, understated, elegant, never competing with the room. She learned which jokes landed with old money crowds and which stories about her own family's accomplishments to leave untold because they made certain wives shift uncomfortably in their seats. The erosion deepened the higher they climbed. Brandon began traveling with a new chief of staff, Cassandra Hale, 29, Yale, former model, daughter of a private equity titan whose Rolodex could fund half of Silicon Alley. Cassandra understood, Brandon said, how to work a room. Cassandra knew which watch signaled quiet wealth and which charity boards opened the right doors. Cassandra's laughter floated across cocktail parties like champagne bubbles, light and irresistible. Jeanette watched her husband's eyes follow that laughter the way they once followed her across crowded cafes in law school. She noticed how his hand lingered at the small of Cassandra's back when guiding her through doorways, a gesture once reserved only for his wife. She noticed, and she said nothing. The night it became unbearable was ordinary on the surface. A fundraiser at the Met. Jeanette had spent hours choosing a midnight blue gown that complemented rather than overshadowed. She stood beside Brandon as he charmed a cluster of European investors. Cassandra arrived late, in liquid gold sequins that caught every flashbulb. Within minutes the group had rearranged itself, Cassandra at Brandon's right. Jeanette subtly edged outward, until she was conversing with a curator about Egyptian artifacts no one else cared to hear about. Later, in the car home, Brandon loosened his tie and said, almost gently, "You looked beautiful tonight, but maybe next time something with a bit more impact?" Cassandra turned heads. "That kind of energy is contagious. It helps close deals." Jeanette stared out at the city lights blurring past. "I thought I was there as your wife, not your closer." He sighed, the sound of a man explaining the obvious to someone slightly slow. "Everything is the deal now, Jeanette. Everything." She felt the fracture widen, but still she stayed. Because love, she had always believed, was patient. Because she had sacrificed too much to walk away over pride. Because she thought endurance was its own kind of strength. She was wrong. The subtle disrespect had become the air she breathed, thin, toxic, and constant. And one ordinary evening, years after the promises and the quiet sacrifices, Brandon would finally say the words that ended it all. But by then, Jeanette had already begun to understand that fitting into someone else's image was never the same as belonging. The evening it ended was unremarkable, which somehow made it worse. Jeanette had prepared a quiet dinner in the penthouse dining room, roasted sea bass, Brandon's favorite, with the lemon herb sauce she'd perfected over the years. The table was set for two, candles flickering softly against the floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the glittering expanse of Central Park far below. She wore the pearl grey dress he once said made her look like moonlight on water. She'd even chilled the Sancerre he preferred. Brandon arrived later than expected, his phone still pressed to his ear as he stepped through the private elevator. He ended the call with a clipped laugh, loosened his tie, and glanced at the table with mild surprise, as though he'd forgotten anniversaries were things that still happened to them. "Smells good," he said, but he didn't sit. Instead, he poured himself a scotch from the bar cart and stood looking out at the city swirling the glass. Jeanette waited. She had learned to wait. Finally, he turned. "We need to talk." The words were ordinary, almost gentle, but they landed with the weight of finality. She felt the air shift, the way it does just before lightning. He didn't raise his voice. He never needed to anymore. Brandon spoke the way powerful men do when they know the outcome is already decided. "I've spoken with legal," he began. "Everything's been arranged to be fair, more than fair. You'll have the apartment in Paris, the settlement we discussed last year, full access to the foundation accounts for your charitable work. No court, no press. Clean." Jeanette's pulse thrummed in her ears, but her face remained composed. Years of practice. "And the reason?" she asked quietly. He exhaled, a sound of mild impatience. "We've been over this. The direction the company is taking, global partnerships, legacy positioning, it requires a certain cohesion. Cassandra and I, we align, publicly, privately, strategically. You've always known you never wanted that level of visibility. This frees you from it, frees her, as though the life they had built together had been a burden she'd been begging to shed. She looked at him, at the man who once traced constellations on her skin during summer nights in the vineyard, who whispered promises against her collarbone when the world felt too big for both of them, and saw only calculation now. The warmth had been replaced by the cool precision of a man curating his future. "Do you love her?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, soft and steady. Brandon hesitated, not out of guilt, but as if weighing how much truth was required. "Love is beside the point at this stage. We work. She amplifies what I've built. You," he stopped, choosing mercy over honesty. "You deserve a life that isn't measured by board approvals and paparazzi lenses." Jeanette almost smiled at the irony. He was casting her out to protect her, from the very world she had helped him conquer. The lawyer arrived 20 minutes later, discreet in a navy suit, carrying a slim leather folder. Papers were laid on the marble console like a surgery tray. Jeanette read each page carefully, her pen moving across the lines with the same calm she once used to review multi-million-dollar contracts on Brandon's behalf. She signed where indicated. No tears, no pleas, no raised voices. When it was done, Brandon offered to have his driver take her anywhere she wished. She declined. She called a car service instead, one she had used quietly for years, for the appointments and errands that never made it onto his calendar. She packed only one suitcase that night. The rest, the gowns, the jewelry, the photographs, could wait for movers or be donated or burn, for all it mattered. She took the small things that were truly hers, her grandmother's Bible, the law school diploma, the sonogram she had not yet shown anyone. Brandon stood in the foyer as she stepped into the elevator. For a moment, something flickered across his face, regret perhaps, or simple relief that there had been no scene. "Take care of yourself, Jeanette," he said. The doors closed between them. Outside, the rain had stopped. The city streets glistened, clean and indifferent. Jeanette slid into the back of the black sedan and gave the driver an address in Harlem, an old brownstone owned by a college friend who had long ago offered refuge if you ever need it. As the car pulled away from the tower that had been her home, she placed a hand on the still, flat plane of her stomach and felt the faint, secret flutter beneath her palm. A life Brandon believed he controlled completely, now growing beyond his reach. She did not cry. Not yet. She simply watched the lights of Manhattan recede in the side mirror, and for the first time in years, breathed air that belonged only to her. Jeanette discovered the truth 3 weeks after she had left the penthouse, in the quiet bathroom of the Harlem brownstone that had become her temporary sanctuary. She had been feeling off for days, waves of exhaustion that crashed over her in the afternoons, a faint queasiness that lingered no matter what she ate. At first she blamed the upheaval, the sleepless nights replaying every moment of Brandon's cool dismissal. But when her cycle didn't arrive, she bought a test from the corner pharmacy and took it with the same measured calm she had used to sign away her marriage. 2 pink lines appeared almost instantly. She sat on the edge of the clawfoot tub, the stick balanced on the porcelain, and stared at the city through the narrow window. Rain traced slow paths down the glass again, as if the sky itself hadn't finished mourning for her. She waited for panic, for despair, for some dramatic surge of emotion that matched the magnitude of what this meant. Instead, she felt something quieter settle over her, a fierce, protective steadiness. This child had been conceived in the final months of a marriage already unraveling. On one of the rare nights, Brandon had come home early and reached for her with something close to the old tenderness. She remembered the way he had whispered her name against her skin that evening, as though for a moment he had remembered who she was beneath the careful image he needed her to maintain. She had let herself believe, just for those hours, that the distance between them could still be bridged. Now she understood that night had been a goodbye neither of them had recognized. Jeanette placed a hand over the place where the future was already taking root. The gesture was instinctive, maternal, absolute. Brandon would never know. Not yet. Perhaps not ever, if that was what safety required. The settlement had included ironclad non-disclosure clauses. He believed money and silence were the same thing. He had moved on with the swift efficiency of a man erasing an outdated prototype, publicly engaged to Cassandra within months. The society pages filled with photographs of them at Aspen, at Art Basel, at the Met Gala, always perfectly lit, perfectly matched. Jeanette watched from a distance the way one watches a storm on the horizon. She did not call, did not text, did not appear at the foundation events where her absence was noted with polite curiosity and then quickly forgotten. She protected the secret the way she had once protected Brandon's dreams. Quietly, completely, without asking for acknowledgement. She told no one at first, not her mother in Atlanta, not the handful of old friends who reached out with careful concern. The child was hers alone to carry, hers alone to decide how and when the world would learn of his existence. She began prenatal visits at a discreet clinic uptown, paying in cash, giving only her maiden name. She read the book she once thought she would share with Brandon, marked the pages, folded down corners that made her smile. She spoke to the tiny life inside her in the evenings, soft words about strength and grace and the beauty of roots that run deeper than any spotlight can reach. Some nights the loneliness pressed in, sharp and cold. She would stand at the brownstone's window, hand resting on the gentle curve that had only just begun to show, and wonder what kind of world she was bringing this boy into, one that had discarded his mother for not fitting the right frame. But then she would feel the flutter beneath her palm, the quiet insistence of a heartbeat that belonged entirely to her, and the doubt would recede. This child was not a weapon. He was not revenge wrapped in innocence. He was proof, undeniable, living proof, that something real and enduring had existed in the ruins of that marriage. One day, when the time was right, he would stand beside her as evidence that love, even flawed and fractured, could still create something unbreakable. Until then, the secret stayed folded close to her heart, growing stronger with every passing day. If Jeanette's quiet strength, her refusal to shatter even when everything was taken from her, resonates with you, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens when she finally steps back into the light. Like this video, drop a comment telling me what you think she should do next, and turn on notifications, because the moment she walks into that gala with the truth holding her hand is going to leave the entire room speechless. You won't want to miss it. Jeanette vanished, the way a tide recedes, slowly, completely, leaving only the faintest trace on the shore. The Paris apartment Brandon had gifted her in the settlement remained empty. She never set foot in it. Instead, she withdrew the portion of the funds she needed and quietly redirected the rest into trusts and accounts, bearing only her name and later her son's. The society columns noted her absence with a single line buried in gossip rounds. Jeanette Armstrong has chosen a private life abroad following her amicable separation. No one pressed for details. Amicable separations among the ultra-wealthy were common. Dramatic ones sold magazines. Hers did neither. She settled, eventually, in a quiet town outside Charlottesville, Virginia, close enough to good hospitals and universities, far enough from Manhattan's orbit that no one looked twice at the elegant black woman walking her toddler through farmers' markets on Saturday mornings. The house was a restored 1920s brick colonial with a wide porch and a garden that backed onto woods. She paid cash. The deed read Jeanette Marie Cole again, her maiden name reclaimed like a breath she had been holding for years. The first year was a cocoon. She gave birth to Elijah in a small birthing center, surrounded only by a doula and the soft hum of monitors. When the nurse placed the warm, squirming bundle on her chest, Jeanette studied his tiny face, Brandon's brow, her mouth, eyes still deciding what color they wanted to be, and felt the final thread to her old life snap. This child belonged to her alone now. She would build a world sturdy enough for him without the brittle scaffolding of someone else's ambition. Days blurred into seasons of deliberate simplicity. She rose early, brewed coffee while Elijah slept, then worked in the hours before he woke, first consulting remotely for non-profit legal clinics, then founding her own small foundation focused on education equity for black and brown girls. The work was meaningful, underfunded, and entirely hers. Grants came in quietly. Impact reports went out the same way. No galas, no donor walls with her name in gold, just results. She learned the rhythms of motherhood with the same measured grace she had once applied to everything else, pureeing sweet potatoes at midnight, reading board books until her voice grew hoarse, rocking through fevers with a calm that masked her own exhaustion. Elijah grew strong and curious, his laughter filling rooms that had never known the echo of boardroom applause. He called her Mama, then Mommy, his small hand always seeking hers when they crossed streets or explored creek beds behind the house. Jeanette changed too. The sleek chignons gave way to natural curls that framed her face like a halo in sunlight. She wore linen dresses and sneakers, clothes chosen for comfort rather than cameras. Her body softened in places, strengthened in others, carrying a growing boy upstairs, gardening until her hands smelled of soil and basil. Mirrors no longer felt like judgment. They reflected a woman who had stopped auditioning for a role she was never meant to play. Old friends from law school found her eventually through careful channels. A few visited, stayed for long weekends, met Elijah, left with quiet awe at how fully she had disappeared, yet how vividly she lived. They brought no gossip from the city. She asked for none. Brandon's wedding to Cassandra had been a splashy affair in Tuscany. Vogue had covered it naturally. Jeanette saw the photographs only because a well-meaning cousin emailed a link. She looked once. Cassandra, radiant in couture white. Brandon smiling the practiced smile of a man whose empire had doubled since the divorce. Elijah, then too, had been napping on her lap. She closed the laptop and took her son outside to chase fireflies instead. Years accumulated like quiet wealth. Elijah started preschool, then kindergarten, his world expanding in safe, incremental circles. Jeanette's foundation grew, scholarships awarded, schools partnered, lives altered without fanfare. She mentored young attorneys over coffee on her porch, taught Elijah to read with the same patience she once reserved for closing arguments. At night, after tucking him in, she sometimes stood at the window watching moonlight silver the garden and felt the old ache recede further. She was not hiding. She was becoming. The spotlight had never truly seen her anyway. Now, in its absence, she had built something luminous and solid, a life measured not in headlines or net worth, but in the steady heartbeat of a little boy who knew, without question, that he was loved beyond condition. And if, on certain evenings, she allowed herself to imagine a day when the world that discarded her would be forced to look again, to truly see, she kept that thought folded close, like a promise kept for the right moment. For now, the disappearance was complete. The rebuilding, quiet and unstoppable, had only just begun. Elijah Armstrong Cole grew up believing the world was fundamentally kind, because that was the truth his mother gave him every day. He never heard Brandon's name spoken with bitterness. Jeanette made the absence simple. Your father and I loved each other once, but we wanted different lives. He's far away, building big things. We're here, building ours. That was all. No elaborate stories, no villains, no voids left gaping. Elijah accepted it the way children accept gravity, something invisible that simply held everything in place. He was a beautiful boy, with his mother's deep brown skin and expressive eyes, and the strong jaw and thoughtful brow that would one day make strangers pause and wonder where they had seen that face before. Jeanette watched the resemblance emerge the way one watches dawn, gradually, undeniably, and with quiet awe. She never pointed it out to him. There would be time enough for mirrors to do that work. Instead, she filled his childhood with certainties. Mornings began with her reading aloud at the kitchen table. First picture books, then chapter books, then the poetry of Gwendolyn Brooks and Langston Hughes that made his small voice rise and fall with rhythm. She taught him to cook, standing him on a stool so he could stir collards or measure flour for cornbread, praising his careful hands the way she once praised closing arguments in mock trial. When he asked questions about money or power, or why some kids at school had drivers and others walked, she answered honestly but gently, "Some people measure success by how loud they are. We measure it by how solid we are." Elijah learned strength as a daily practice, not a sermon. When he fell off his bike and scraped his knee raw, Jeanette cleaned the wound without flinching, then sat with him on the porch steps until the tears stopped. "Pain comes," she said, pressing a cool cloth to his skin, "but it doesn't get to decide who you become. You do." He nodded solemnly, 6 years old and already storing the lesson. She never coached resentment. When he noticed, around 7, that other families had fathers at school plays, he asked once, only once, why his didn't come. Jeanette met his eyes and told him the truth in language he could carry. He chose a different path. That's his story. Ours is this one, and it's good. Elijah considered it, then asked if they could build the Pinewood Derby car together instead. They did. And the little blue racer took second place. The photo of them holding the ribbon, her smile wide and genuine, his gap-toothed grin triumphant, went on the refrigerator and stayed there for years. Discipline was quiet but firm. Tantrums were met with calm boundaries, lies with conversations about trust that left him feeling the weight of his own choices. Jeanette never raised her voice, never needed to. Her presence was authority enough. Elijah grew up knowing exactly where the lines were and exactly why they mattered. He learned generosity early. Part of every allowance went into a jar for the foundation's scholarship fund. When he outgrew clothes, they were folded neatly and delivered together to families who needed them. At 9, he organized a lemonade stand to raise money for a classmate's mother undergoing chemotherapy. He raised $432 and delivered it himself, shaking the woman's hand like a small gentleman. Music entered his life through Jeanette's old records. Miles Davis on Sunday mornings, Nina Simone when rain tapped the windows. He took piano lessons from a retired professor down the street, practicing scales while Jeanette worked in the next room. His fingers grew long and sure, coaxing melody from ivory the way his mother coaxed dignity from silence. And always, always there were books. Shelves lining the hallways, stacks on bedside tables. Elijah read voraciously, history, science fiction, biographies of people who had built something from nothing. When he discovered stories of men who abandoned families for ambition, he brought them to Jeanette without accusation, just curiosity. She answered his questions, then asked her own, "What kind of man do you want to be?" He thought for a long time before answering, "The kind who stays." By 10, Elijah was tall for his age, thoughtful, quick to smile but slow to anger. He protected smaller kids on the playground without hesitation, helped neighbors carry groceries, held doors for strangers. People said he had an old soul. Jeanette knew better. He had a nurtured one. He did not carry resentment because none had been handed to him. He carried instead the steady certainty that he was deeply loved, deeply seen, and deeply enough. One day he would stand in a ballroom glittering with wealth and power, his small hand tucked securely in his mother's. He would not speak a word of accusation. He would not need to. His existence would be the sentence his father had never allowed himself to imagine. But for now, he was simply a boy learning who he was in the shelter of a mother who had chosen strength over bitterness, grace over grievance. And in that choice, she gave him the greatest inheritance of all, the freedom to become whole without having to hate anyone to do it. The grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria had never been more radiant. Chandeliers dripped light like liquid gold onto the crowd below. Senators, tech titans, old money heiresses, all swirling in a carefully choreographed display of power and privilege. Cameras flashed along the perimeter, capturing every calculated smile, every strategic handshake. At the center of it all stood Brandon Armstrong, taller than most, his tuxedo cut to perfection, one arm loosely around Cassandra's waist. She glittered in a backless gown of molten gold, her laughter bright and practiced as she leaned into him for yet another photograph. The charity gala was the event of the season. Armstrong Global's triumphant return to New York society after a record-breaking merger. Brandon's speech had just ended to thunderous applause. He was at the height of everything he had engineered: wealth, influence, legacy. The room belonged to him tonight. Then the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened. Conversation didn't stop all at once. It faltered, like a record skipping. A hush rippled outward from the entrance, slow and inexorable, until even the string quartet seemed to soften. Heads turned, glasses paused halfway to lips. Cameras swung toward the new arrival. Jeanette stepped into the light. She wore white, regal, luminous white that caught every crystal gleam and threw it back softer, stronger. The gown was off the shoulder, long-sleeved, embroidered with delicate gold that traced her collarbones and skimmed the curve of her waist, before falling into a train that whispered across the marble behind her. Her hair was swept into an elegant twist, diamonds glinting at her ears and throat, understated but unmistakable. She looked like serenity made flesh, like something sacred that had decided to walk among mortals again. And she was not alone. By her side, his small hand tucked confidently into hers, walked Elijah. 10 years old, immaculate in a tailored midnight blue suit that mirrored his mother's quiet elegance. His curls were neatly shaped, his posture straight, his expression calm and curious as he took in the vast room. He did not cling, he did not hide, he simply stood beside her, as though this moment, this entrance, had always been part of the plan. The resemblance struck like a physical blow. Brandon saw them first. His smile froze mid-conversation, the hand that had been gesturing toward a senator dropping slowly to his side. Cassandra followed his gaze, her own expression shifting from practiced delight to confusion, then to something sharper. The gold of her gown suddenly seemed garish against the white across the room. Jeanette did not rush. She moved forward at a measured pace, Elijah matching her stride without effort. Every step drew the silence deeper. Phones rose discreetly. Whispers began, faint at first, then spreading like smoke. Is that? It can't be. Look at the boy. Jeanette's eyes found Brandon's across the expanse and held them. There was no triumph in her gaze, no pleading, no rage. Only clarity, recognition, a quiet, unshakable command. See me now. She stopped perhaps 20 feet away, close enough for detail, far enough for the moment to belong to the entire room. Elijah looked up at her, then followed her gaze to the man who shared his brow, his mouth, the shape of his eyes just beginning to emerge. He did not flinch. He simply waited, trusting. Brandon took one involuntary step forward, then stopped. Cassandra's hand tightened on his arm. Whether to steady herself or to stake claim, no one could tell. Her face had paled beneath flawless makeup, lips parted in a question she hadn't yet found words for. The orchestra had gone entirely silent. Even the photographers seemed to hold their breath. Jeanette spoke first, her voice low but carrying effortlessly in the hush. Good evening, Brandon. Simple, composed. The same voice that had once read bedtime stories and negotiated million-dollar grants now cut through years of calculated erasure. Brandon's throat worked. Jeanette. The single word came out rough, almost lost. He looked down at Elijah, at the boy who was undeniably his, undeniably hers, and something fractured behind his eyes. Not guilt, not yet. Recognition. The sudden, vertiginous understanding that control had always been an illusion. Elijah tilted his head slightly, studying the man who had shaped half his blood without ever knowing it. He offered no smile, no accusation. He simply existed, tall for his age, poised, the living truth standing quietly at his mother's side. Jeanette's fingers tightened gently around her son's hand. She did not look away from Brandon. The room remained frozen, waiting for the next breath, the next word, the next unraveling. But Jeanette had already delivered everything she came to say, not with shouts, not with demands, just with presence. And in that silence, the truth stood taller than any empire Brandon had ever built. Cassandra Hale Armstrong had spent years perfecting the art of never looking rattled. She had learned early that in rooms like this, composure was currency, smile calibrated, posture flawless, laughter timed to land like champagne bubbles. Tonight, in her custom gold gown that had taken 3 fittings and a team of Italian artisans, she had felt invincible. The cameras loved her. The donors deferred to her. Brandon's hand at her waist had felt like ownership of the future itself. Then the doors opened, and the white-clad woman with the child walked in, and Cassandra felt the ground tilt beneath her crystal heels. At first it was only confusion, a flicker at the edge of her vision, Brandon's body going rigid beside her. She turned, expecting some minor distraction, a late celebrity perhaps, or a rival CEO making an entrance. Instead she saw Jeanette. Older, yes, but unmistakable, transformed into something luminous and dangerous. And the boy, God, the boy. The resemblance was a slap, not subtle, not deniable. A miniature Brandon in miniature tuxedo, holding the ex-wife's hand like he belonged there. Cassandra's smile stayed frozen in place, but inside, something cold and sharp uncoiled. She had always known about Jeanette in the abstract, the quiet, elegant predecessor who had conveniently disappeared when Brandon needed a more dynamic partner. Cassandra had studied the old photographs the way generals study battlefields. Jeanette in pearls and subdued colors, always slightly out of frame, always smiling like someone who didn't fully grasp the game. Cassandra had felt pity, then relief. The woman had made it easy, but this was not easy. The hush in the ballroom pressed against her eardrums. She felt eyes sliding toward her, measuring, comparing. The gold gown that had felt regal 10 minutes ago now seemed loud, desperate, trying too hard. Jeanette's white was effortless, commanding. Cassandra's fingers tightened on Brandon's arm, nails pressing through the fabric. He didn't seem to notice. He was staring at the boy, as though staring at a ghost of his own making. Cassandra leaned in, her voice a practiced murmur that didn't match the hammering in her chest. "Darling, who is that?" Brandon's answer came too late, too hoarse. "Jeanette." She waited for more. An explanation, a dismissal, a plan. None came. His attention was pinned across the room, and for the first time in their marriage, Cassandra felt invisible beside him. Panic fluttered, then clawed. She scanned the crowd for allies. The senator's wife met her eyes briefly, then looked away. A tech heiress whispered behind a manicured hand. Phones were out now, discreet but unmistakable. Tomorrow's headlines wrote themselves in Cassandra's mind. Armstrong heir revealed. Forgotten ex makes shocking return. The comments sections would be brutal. They always were when a second wife was involved. She tried to laugh, light, dismissive, but it came out brittle. "Well, this is unexpected." Still nothing from Brandon. The boy looked up at Jeanette then, a small gesture that somehow made the moment more intimate, more unbreakable. Cassandra felt a surge of something hot and ugly, insecurity she had buried years ago, about her own roots, her modeling days. The whispers that she was decorative rather than indispensable rose like bile. She had worked so hard to become the perfect extension of Brandon's brand. The boards she sat on, the causes she championed, the way she dressed, spoke, networked, all of it designed to amplify him. And now, with one silent entrance, Jeanette had diminished her to an interloper in her own triumph. Cassandra took a step forward, instinct pushing her to confront, to reclaim the narrative. But her heel caught slightly on the hem of her gown, a tiny stumble no one else noticed, but that felt catastrophic to her. She recovered with a bright smile that hurt her face. Jeanette hadn't moved closer. She didn't need to. The space between them crackled with everything unsaid. Cassandra's mind raced through scenarios. Security could escort them out, too obvious. Brandon could deny paternity, impossible. She could walk over and air kiss like old friends, humiliating. Every option felt like loss. A photographer edged nearer, lens trained on the tableau. Cassandra imagined the split image tomorrow. Jeanette serene in white. Cassandra gilded and grasping. The optics were devastating. She turned to Brandon again, voice lower now, urgent. "We should say something. Greet them. Control this." But Brandon's eyes hadn't left the boy. Something raw and unguarded moved across his face, wonder, perhaps, or the first crack of consequence. Cassandra felt the social ground beneath her begin to crumble. Whispers grew bolder. A venture capitalist she'd courted for months drifted away mid-sentence. The room's allegiance was shifting, subtle but relentless, toward the woman in white who had said only 2 words and yet rewritten the entire evening. For the first time since she'd stepped into Brandon's world, Cassandra Hale Armstrong understood what it felt like to be the one who didn't quite fit, and the panic, cold and complete, settled in her chest like a stone. Brandon Armstrong had built his life on the conviction that everything could be managed, optimized, rebranded, if necessary. Companies, markets, reputations, even relationships, all responded to the right application of leverage. He had ended his marriage to Jeanette with the same cool precision he applied to hostile takeovers. Clean documents, generous terms, no public mess. She had signed without protest. She had disappeared. The narrative wrote itself. Amicable parting, mutual respect, forward momentum. He had never imagined blood would refuse to be negotiated. Now, standing in the center of a ballroom he had effectively purchased for the evening, Brandon felt the illusion fracture. Jeanette's greeting still hung in the air. 2 quiet words that carried more weight than any accusation. "Good evening, Brandon." Calm, unhurried, as though she had simply stepped out for coffee and returned years later to collect her coat. His eyes kept returning to the boy, Elijah. The name arrived unbidden, supplied by a society columnist who had sidled close enough to overhear Jeanette murmur it. Elijah Cole, 10 years old. The math was merciless. The resemblance was not subtle. It was structural. The same brow line Brandon saw in childhood photographs of himself. The same thoughtful pause before a smile. The same way of holding the head when listening. Every detail was a fingerprint he could not deny, could not delegate, could not spin. Cassandra's grip on his arm had turned vice-like, but he barely registered it. The room's attention pressed in from all sides. Curiosity, speculation, the faint predatory gleam of people scenting weakness at the top of the food chain. Phones were recording now, discreetly angled. Tomorrow this moment would be dissected on every financial network, every gossip site, every private group chat among the elite. He should speak, he should move, he should reassert control. Instead, he took one step forward, then another, drawn by a gravity older than any boardroom. Jeanette watched him approach, her expression unchanged, serene, unyielding. Elijah glanced up at her again, a silent check-in, and she gave the smallest squeeze of his hand. Reassurance. Permission to simply be. Brandon stopped a few feet away. Up close, Jeanette was more breathtaking than memory allowed. The years had refined rather than diminished her. The same rich brown skin glowing under the chandeliers. The same steady gaze that once looked at him across late-night takeout containers and believed in futures larger than either of them. Only now that gaze held no expectation, no plea. It simply observed. "Jeanette," he said again, voice rougher this time. "I didn't know." It sounded pathetic even to him. A confession and an excuse in 3 words. She inclined her head slightly. "No," she answered, soft enough that only their small circle could hear. "You didn't." The simplicity of it undid him more than anger ever could have. He looked down at Elijah. The boy met his eyes without fear or eagerness, just quiet curiosity, the way a child studies a new species at the zoo. Brandon searched for something to say, anything that would restore order. "Hello," he managed finally. "I'm Brandon." Elijah considered this, then offered a polite nod. "I know." 2 words from a 10-year-old, delivered with perfect composure, and Brandon felt the floor drop another inch. Cassandra appeared at his side then, smile brilliant and brittle. "What a surprise," she said, voice pitched for the nearby microphones. "Jeanette, darling, you look wonderful. And this must be your son. How lovely." The warmth was flawless, but her eyes betrayed her. Sharp, territorial, calculating damage. Jeanette acknowledged her with the same calm courtesy. "Cassandra, congratulations on the merger. I've followed from a distance." The implication hung delicate and lethal. "I have seen everything you thought was hidden." Brandon felt the conversation slipping further from his grasp. He tried to summon the version of himself that closed 9-figure deals over lunch, decisive, charming, in command. "Why now?" he asked Jeanette, low. "Why here?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked around the ballroom, at the chandeliers, the cameras, the clusters of wealth and influence that had once measured her and found her wanting. "Because this is the room that decided I didn't belong," she said finally. "And I wanted you to see that some things can't be erased by signatures or settlements. Blood remembers." Elijah shifted slightly, his small shoulder brushing her gown. A subtle reminder. "I am here. I am real." Brandon felt something vital loosen inside his chest. Not guilt exactly, more like the sudden dizzying awareness of how much he had engineered his life to avoid consequence. He had believed wealth insulated him from biology, from history, from the quiet persistence of truth. He had been wrong. Around them, the whispers grew louder. A hedge fund titan excused himself from a conversation to watch more closely. A senator's wife angled her phone. The narrative was no longer his to shape. Brandon looked at his son, at the child he had never held, never taught to ride a bike, never tucked in at night, and understood, with a clarity that bordered on pain, that power could buy many things, but it could not rewrite blood. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Brandon Armstrong had no idea what move to make next. Jeanette felt the moment shift, the way one feels a tide turn before the wave arrives. The ballroom's frozen silence had held long enough for the truth to settle. Undeniable, unhurried, complete. Brandon's face, usually so controlled, now carried the raw edges of a man confronting the limits of his own design. Cassandra's composure had cracked into something brittle and desperate. The whispers had swelled into a low hum of speculation that would follow them all out into the night and into tomorrow's headlines. But Jeanette had not come for chaos. She looked down at Elijah, whose small hand remained steady in hers. He met her eyes with the quiet trust that had been their private language for 10 years. She gave him the faintest smile, enough to say, "We're all right," enough to say, "We're leaving on our terms." Then she turned her gaze back to Brandon. "I didn't come here to disrupt your evening," she said, her voice low and even, carrying only to those closest. "I came so that the next time someone tells the story of who you are, they'll have to include all of it." Brandon opened his mouth, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to negotiate, perhaps to ask the questions now burning behind his eyes, but Jeanette continued before he could find the words. "Elijah is happy. He is loved. He is whole. That was never yours to give or take. Tonight was simply clarity." She let the word linger, soft but absolute. Cassandra made a small sound, half laugh, half protest, but Jeanette did not acknowledge it. There was nothing left to prove to the woman in gold. The contrast had already spoken for itself. Jeanette took one deliberate step backward, guiding Elijah with her. The movement was graceful, unhurried, the train of her white gown whispering across the marble like a closing curtain. The crowd parted instinctively, cameras flashing in a final, frantic flurry. She did not pause for photographs. She did not offer final words for the microphones now edging closer. She simply walked. Through the hush that followed her like a wake, past the clusters of wealth and influence that had once measured her and found her lacking, past the man who had rewritten their history to exclude her. Elijah walked beside her, his stride confident, his small shoulders squared. He did not look back. At the grand doors, Jeanette paused only long enough to smooth a non-existent wrinkle from his lapel, a maternal gesture so intimate it felt like privacy reclaimed in public. Then they stepped through together, into the cool marble corridor beyond the ballroom's glare. The doors closed behind them with a soft, final thud. Outside, the night air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of impending snow. Their car waited at the curb, a discreet black sedan, no flash, no entourage. The driver held the door and Jeanette guided Elijah in first. Then followed, the white gown folding around her like wings settling. As the car pulled away from the Waldorf, Elijah leaned against her side, warm and solid. "Are we going home?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she said. "We're going home." He nodded, content, and rested his head on her shoulder. Jeanette looked out the window at the city lights blurring past, Manhattan's indifferent sparkle, the same streets that had once swallowed her whole. Tonight they looked smaller, less commanding. She felt no triumph, no bitterness, only the deep, quiet certainty of a woman who had rebuilt herself piece by careful piece, far from prying eyes, and had now stepped back into the light exactly as she chose to be seen, radiant, composed, untouchable. The headlines tomorrow would frenzy. The speculation would run for weeks. Brandon would navigate consequences he could not buy his way out of. Cassandra would smile through interviews that would never quite erase the image of white against gold. None of it mattered. Jeanette placed her hand over Elijah's, feeling the steady beat of his pulse beneath her fingers. This was her victory. Not the frozen ballroom, not the shattered illusions, not the public reckoning. It was the life she had grown in the quiet. Strong roots, open sky, a child who knew his worth without needing a spotlight to prove it. She was whole. She was seen, truly seen, for the first time in years, not as an accessory or an inconvenience, but as the architect of her own dignity. And she was untouchable, not because no one could reach her, but because she no longer needed anyone's hand to hold her up. The car merged into the flow of the city, carrying them south toward the bridge, toward the life waiting beyond the glare. Behind them, the Gala continued without her. Ahead, everything already belonged to them.